Okay, so your assignment today is going to be to watch this video and finish filling out the worksheet we started last week. That worksheet is called the Intro to the Bible Class Questions and Notes 1516, and you should have already downloaded it, or you can find it under the Intro to the Bible module on Canvas. In class, we did the first 12 questions, and the slide that you see right now was the last slide that we did in class together. So we will be starting on question number 13 today. You'll want to make sure that you fill in questions 13 through 16 as we go, and then we'll end with a journal. So today we're going to be talking about oral tradition. An oral tradition can be defined as the transmission of a people's history, culture, religion, laws, etc. by word of mouth from one generation to the next. We simulated this in 2 of the 3 class periods when I told you the story about the frog. I took one group into the hallway and read them a very long and detailed story, which I asked them to repeat from memory to a second group, who then repeated to another group. Each time, the story basically remained the same at its heart, but most of the details were forgotten. Now, that's because we didn't grow up in an oral culture, so we're not very good at remembering things. But oral traditions form in oral cultures where they would have a much better memory for the details. That's because in an oral culture, most information is spoken. However, the story is never exactly the same twice because the storyteller is actually encouraged to adapt the story to fit different audiences. We still do this today. If you're talking about what you did this weekend, you might tell that story differently to a friend versus a teacher or a parent or a grandparent or a complete stranger. Based on the age or how well you know someone, you might include more or less details or even use different terminology. You adapt the story to fit the current audience. In an oral culture, changes that make the story more relevant are encouraged. You can also see this today if more than one person experiences the same event, they might still describe that same event differently. So the way the story is told depends not only on the audience, but also on the storyteller. Now, things are a little bit different today because we don't live in an oral culture. We live in a print culture today. And so you may remember from your famous Jesuit presentations, it was very important to have all of the accurate facts, to cite your sources exactly. We're always very big on getting exact quotes and making sure you talk about where you got your information from, using exact quotations and not changing things. So it's going to be difficult for us in reading the Bible because it's growing out of a different culture. So instead of trying to look for the accurate facts and exact details, we need to remember that it's coming out of an oral culture and instead seek the deeper meaning of the story. All you need to write down for this slide is the fact that we don't live in an oral culture today. So all of this is leading us up to the fact that we need to explore how we arrived at the Bible that we're going to be reading this year today. And that Bible didn't just poof arrive out of thin air. In order for a story or teaching to make it into the Bible, it went through the following 5-step process. First, someone had a lived experience in which they clearly felt the presence of God. So something happened and someone identified the presence of God in it. and they felt that it was something important. That's where everything starts. Next, they told someone about it. That's often what we do when important experiences occur. And so people talk about their experience of God, and it's passed on by oral tradition. Now, as we saw in class, for those classes that were able to participate in that activity, talking about the story with the frog, you may have seen that the details may have changed each time the story was told, but the main idea, that there was a story about a frog, remained. For the class that didn't get to do that activity, you can think about a game of telephone, right? If you have a message and you whisper it from person 1 to person 2, and then person 2 to person 3, and so on and so forth, the more complicated the message, the harder it is to get that across. But usually, as long as you have a somewhat concise message, or as long as you stick to the heart of the message, that will be preserved. However, the third step is an event in the history of the people causes the need for the stories or teachings to be preserved in writing. And we did this with our third person who then wrote down their version of the story. And so this is when something happens. Maybe it's that the people who first had these experiences of God are dying out, or there is an exile, and there's a fear that the culture is going to be lost. Something happens where a group of people says, we need to make sure that these stories are not lost. And so they begin to be preserved in writing. And so now, instead of the story changing with different storytellers and audiences, where the kernel at the heart of the story remains the same, but the details might ebb and flow, now we have a story in writing that while it's being passed around, the words are not changing. The next step is that the written pieces are collected and edited. And I did this at the end of class when I collected the piece of paper from each of my number 3 people. If I wanted to continue the analogy here, I would then take all of those different examples, trying to collect this story about this frog that had been written down, and if I wanted to then edit the story, I might start with whatever I thought was the best one, and then I'd look at the rest and say, oh, this story has a detail that the rest don't have, and I want to make sure that that gets preserved. So I'm going to take that detail and add it in here. I might see that there are 2 different versions of a certain element in the story, and I might decide that I want to preserve both versions, so I might choose to include both of them. That process of collecting those different stories and editing them so that they fit together is the 4th step. The 5th and final step is that the many books are evaluated, and some are chosen by the faith community as inspired by God and included in the canon. Now, when I say canon, I don't mean like the kind that set a cannonball at St. Ignatius, but rather I am referring to the books that made it into the Bible. Now, when we say inspired by God, we're going to really unpack what that means next week. But for now, just know that a great deal of consideration was put into deciding which books made the final cut. There are other books out there, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, who went through those first 4 steps, but did not make this 5th step of inclusion into the Bible. And that's how we get to the Bible today. Now, once we reach the canon, that's not the end of the story either, but that's as far as we're going to go today. So the very last thing I'd like to ask of you today is to answer these 3 questions in your journal. So whether you're keeping that on your iPad or in your notebook or binder, if you could please title it Bible Reaction Journal and write down whatever date it is that you're listening to this video. First, I'd like you to respond to, was there anything in this PowerPoint that surprised you? And that could be from today's video or from the first 12 questions that you answered last week. Number 2, is there anything you don't understand from the PowerPoint? And in addition to writing that in your journal, please make sure you circle or somehow indicate on your notes sheet any of the ones that you're confused about, so the next time you see me in class, you can ask me about it. And finally, consider the question, how might the fact that stories and religious scriptures were passed down orally influence our understanding of them? And please explain your answer to that question. Once you've taken a moment to respond to those 3 questions under the heading Bible Reaction Journal in your journal, you have completed this assignment. Make sure that you filled in all of the notes for questions 13 through 16 on your Intro to the Bible class questions and notes. And I will see you next time. Thanks.